This is Requiem Metal Podcast, episode 81, Celtic Frost. We just heard Massacra from Hellhammer. This is the Requiem Metal Podcast. I'm Mark.
And I'm Jason. And we're not dedicating the whole show to Hellhammer, for those of you who are diehard old school fans. But we're kind of covering Celtic Frost in a little two-part special for you.
That's right.
To start the new year the right way with, the entryway into hell.
Oh, a band that everybody's heard of. Not everybody has the stuff, but I think is probably the single most biggest influence on extreme metal genre.
Probably
Celtic Frost and Hellhammer.
Yeah, I would say because you can draw lines out of Celtic Frost and Hellhammer that go not just to sort of death metal, but they go to black metal, they go to grindcore, they go
imagery of black metal is almost all dictated by. I mean, Venom was more of a Hollywood version of that, but Celtic Frost is like, as far as like the second wave of black metal goes.
Sure.
I mean, there's the blueprints right there.
Well, and then, we were listening to some tunes that had a discharge repulsion feel, and then there's obviously the sort of the Celtic Frost breakdown and a lot of the Napalm Death and early grindcore stuff, and then obviously these guys, in terms of vocally, hugely influenced death metal, in terms of going to the next level, sort of guttural and extreme stuff. I mean, even doom metal to some extent.
The whole avant-garde stuff that they started doing later on in their career was like hugely influenced. I mean, it's not as as refined as it is now, or as it went on to its influences, but the stuff they were trying in their limited knowledge and being novices at instruments, I think all contributed to that overall sound. Is like, if they had crazy solos and were super like technically proficient, you'd be losing something. These are all like primal riffs when it comes down to it.
And when we talk in part 2 more about like Into the Pandemonium and even some of the experimentation on like To Mega Therion.
Oh, and the whole show we're going to do on Vanity Nemesis.
Yeah. Well, not just that, but I mean, we have to play Cherry Orchards for all the Cold Lake fans that are out there.
Yeah.
So,
Therion,
you'll have to stay tuned to part 2 to see if we actually...
Therion wouldn't exist without Celtic Frost.
Yeah, this is true. Well, there's a lot of bands that wouldn't exist without Celtic Frost.
But even the trajectory that Therion takes.
Oh yeah,
from their early career to like
pompous,
the really like
classical craziness. Yeah. Well, in fact, I remember on the Beauty and Darkness sampler.
Beauty and Black.
Well, no, they had the song To Therion.
Oh.
It was actually called, and it was like, like just like awful. I mean, it was like track 2, and I skipped it. You know, I think Moonshield started the whole album off, and then like I went to the Hypocrisy song that was on there. But that was a good sampler, except for the fluffy gothic crap that was on there. But back to Necromosa. Oh my gosh. But back to Hellhammer, and the tune you just heard was Massacra, and Hellhammer, it has, you know, kind of auspicious beginnings. You know, it started off as a 3-piece, and originally it was, you know, obviously the central figure of Celtic Frost, for those of you who are, you know, living under a rock the last 30 years or
Tom
so.
Fisher.
Is Tom Fisher, or Tom G. Warrior, or, as he was known in Hellhammer era, as Tom's Satanic Slaughter Warrior. So, and who you heard on that tune was Martin Ain, the bassist as well, who's kind of in and out of Celtic Frost through the years.
And back now.
Yeah, and is back now. And he was Slade Necros. And then the drummer actually was Bruce Day, also known as Denial Fiend Bloodhunter. So, you know, in terms of, you know, the black metal influence, there's another one, you know, the sort of adopting of kind of nicknames or...
Well, you know, Sodom did the same thing, like, you know, Tom Angel Ripper.
Yeah,
I mean, that kind of stuff, which is, I think, is the coolest stage
Angel Ripper is as cool as they get, you know. But originally it had is it Tom's brother? I
have no idea.
No, because it was Steve Warrior, so it wasn't Steve Fisher. So
it's like Bath Doom Occulta and Demoness Doom Occulta.
Yeah, exactly.
You know? They're brothers in metal, but not brothers in genetics.
And I don't know what really happened. I don't know a whole lot about the early beginnings of Hellhammer, like why the original founder. You know, I think he was on some of the demos that they did, the Death Fiend and the Triumph of Death demos from like June of '83. But in terms of the record that most people know Hellhammer from, which is Apocalyptic Raids, it's the 3-piece I just mentioned. And I think he was a guitarist and a vocalist, you know, Steve Warrior. So I think he just sort of shared some of the responsibilities with Tom and stuff. But
if you want to know the definitive history of Celtic Frost, check out the R.E. Morbid book, penned by Tom G. Warrior.
Yeah, we were just talking about it. Neither of us have read it, but I've heard good things about it. That it's kind of.
I wish he'd do an audiobook.
Yeah, there you go.
I have more time to listen to that stuff.
Because Tom Warrior, for what it's worth, I mean, he's sort of a Chuck Schuldiner type personality. I mean, I think he kind of rubs some people the wrong way.
I think he's got a strong ego.
Yeah.
I mean, he's got a vision to what he does, and
pretty uncompromising for the most part.
He's kind of a abrasive dude for the most part, I think. I mean, you ever see interviews with the guy, he doesn't seem like to come across as the most friendly, you know, individual. But yeah, definitely, you know, one of the most like prolific songwriters of, you know, the extreme metal genre.
Well, I think
exist without him.
I think what you were saying too is that, you know, this guy's not a guitar hero. You know, I mean, you know, Chuck Schuldiner, you know, developed from a primitive state, but he sort of advanced, and I feel like Tom did, but he didn't advance in terms of his guitar playing. He advanced, I guess, in his like sort of soundscape of like compositional ideas and things like that. Yeah,
because you listen to like Monotheist,
you know.
And I mean, as far as like from looking at like a technical aspect, he hasn't really progressed too much as far as like learning new chords, but as far as like making new noises and soundscapes and just like setting a mood.
And there you go. I think the thing that you're going to hear in Hellhammer and Celtic Frost is they're a mood setting band. I mean, if you know, the song we're going to play next from Apocalyptic Raids, Triumph of Death, I wrote down on some of my notes, it's as if it was sort of like puked out by hell. You know, like the first 3 minutes of the song is just, you know, awful. But awful in a cool way. I mean, it's just like gurgling noises.
At the time, nothing like that had probably been recorded and released by anyone. So.
And that's what, you know, when you get to part 2 in Monotheist, which Mark just mentioned, which is the comeback record, and probably the last record from what I've read. They're pretty much done now. You know, they do symphonies and different sort of movements, and there's a 14-minute song that we'll play called Synagoga Satana, and it's just, I mean, it's just all about the sort of emotional wreck of a sound that's kind of happening, the sort of utter despair put on record in a way, you know, and that's where the doom metal genre borrows, I think, a lot from some of the things that Frost did as well, you know. I mean, Candlemass took some of the early kind of Frost riffs and brightened them up a little bit, but that sort of bottom heaviness that you hear on like Morbid Tales and some of that,
everything's power chords.
It's there, you know. And the other thing that you heard, especially in a tune like Massacra, is the punk influence. The Motorhead, was probably a big influence, and
that and just early punk, I'm sure was early
Discharge.
influence.
I've heard.
The funny thing is, Discharge
before.
does not have the same reverence in punk circles as it does in metal circles.
Yeah,
for some
weird
reason.
That they sort of.
Well, I think it's the whole Angro thing is like. That was more of a UK based deal, and I think that was not necessarily it was like such a niche thing in the punk scene, but for the metal scene it seemed like, wow, these guys are like kindred spirits.
Sure.
Like they're screaming more so than being like the snotty vocals.
When it was like probably like 5% of punk was this anacro stuff, but that was the 5% that any of the metalheads could like tolerate, and so they grabbed onto that and like blew it up and elevated it so big and made Discharge like legendary, in a way, whereas like you said, from a punk perspective it was just like some like weird
little subgenre,
subgenre that nobody cared about, but obviously like influences, Venom has to be like kind of one of the bigger ones. They're kind of taking the Venom sort of like assault and kind of polishing it a little bit,
even making it more. I mean, Venom was pretty. I mean, as far as black metal, if you want to call them black metal, the whole term, whatever. But they were very, very stripped down, very almost like the cock rock equivalent of of the black metal. I think Celtic Frost kind of added an air of legitimacy along with Bathory.
Yeah,
actually being like truly like evil sounding and not just in an image and over the top kind of spectacle.
Oh yeah, and I mean a tune like Massacra is fun to sort of listen to and stuff. But like I said, when we get to Triumph of Death next, you're gonna sort of hear the sort of utter despair and the doom and the gloom and the just evilness finally put down on record. I don't know if you get that necessarily from a tune like Massacra. I mean, it's pretty nasty for its time. I mean, nasty vocally and primitive drumming and just primitive riffing, and it's very heartfelt. I think that's the thing you can always say about Celtic Frost is even when they have failed experiments, there's like they're not like trying to construct things.
Yeah, he's honest. Honest with his delivery.
Honest failures and honest successes, and that's the one thing you'll say. I mean, I guess the only thing that's not honest is probably Cold Lake, because I think that was sort of a studio kind of push that was sort of happening. But in terms of like where did you come into Celtic Frost?
Oh boy, early 90s.
Okay,
probably 93 or 4.
Yeah,
that's when I first started, and it was all from reading interviews with people about this and that, and they weren't. I think they were put out by Noise, which at that time was still putting out records as as distribution and licensing.
Yeah.
But I actually, the first time I heard them was on record.
Okay. You got the records from the radio station, right?
Yeah, it was this old radio station that was basically had their entire metal archives that was basically being like thrown away if they weren't pulled out of the trash. So
yeah,
that's how I've got all my Destruction, Sodom, Celtic Frost, all that stuff.
Yeah, that was I've seen some of that collection. That's nice.
I got the first Bathory record.
That's ridiculous.
I mean, it had probabably never been played on the radio. I'm positive it's never been played.
Yeah, there's no place for that at CME radio and stuff, but. My experience with Celtic Frost, I mean, I think you and I both came in at a weird time where Celtic Frost, in a way, like was sort of tarnished. Like there was,
totally.
Cold Lake had sort of happened, and Vanity Nemesis, which some people see as kind of a reputable, okay record. At least it wasn't Cold Lake,
Mm-hmm.
But so like I didn't get my hands on actual like Celtic Frost discs until probably the late '90s. But I had Chris had lent me, or even had an extra copy of that Dwell Records in memory of Celtic Frost tribute record, and that was a sort of a big deal. Speaking of Massacra, Emperor did a cover there, and Slaves on that. Opeth did Circle of the Tyrants.
Mm-hmm.
Graves on there.
Yeah.
There was, I think Grave did Into the Pandemonium Mesmerized, if I do believe, like a weird, like
I don't
totally
remember.
Unexpected for Grave.
That was one of the album covers that I was commissioned to do the logo for.
Oh, really?
And something fell through.
Oh, okay.
I did a pretty sweet logo. No, this was when I was just freelancing.
Oh,
stuff.
okay.
This was like before Necropolis went out of business.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah, because was that Dwell or Necropolis that put that out?
They were the same. I think
they were sort of
entity, but yeah, like Rochelle from Century Media, she used to be a longtime runner. I don't think she's involved with Century Media.
No, I remember Rochelle back when.
But she actually, she was the one that was compiling all the tracks and everything. So.
Huh. Yeah, and I mean, it's for tribute albums, it's a decent introduction, and I mean, you get a sense of the scope of the band, the good, the bad, the ugly kind of thing, and you kind of hear the riffing that's sort of in there, and so...
Well, and you see, like, if you're really into Grave, like, see, well, what did Grave pull out of this? What did Emperor pull out of this?
Sure. And Slave's cover, Procreation of the Wicked, was so, like, offbeat. It was kind of right when Enslaved was doing, like, Eld and some of their weird... they're starting to get a little more out there, you know, and you can hear that
when Roy
interpretation
Kronheim started coming in the mix.
So that made me kind of like look into Celtic Frost a little deeper, and then I eventually got my hands, I think, on a used copy of To Mega Therion, and then Kuhn, you and I were joking about this with the Marduk shows, buying multiple copies. He had an extra copy of Into Pandemonium because he had bought it twice, and he threw that my way. And
which I never even bought till last year.
So, and then I eventually picked up Morbid Tales, and then Apocalyptic Raids, which is the Hellhammer. So
recently reissued.
Yeah, and then the thing we should say about Hellhammer before we play Triumph of Death here in a second is that Hellhammer, the story goes, is as the day after they broke up, they formed Celtic Frost. So, I mean,
it's like Carnage and Dismember.
Yeah, it's just like exactly.
Or Nihilist and Entomb.
Yeah, it's just sort of seamless. So that's why we decided to play some Hellhammer at even though it's a Celtic Frost show, because it's kind of essential. So, any thoughts on Triumph of Death here? Or Into the Crypts of Rays, which we're going to hear the first official.
Into Crypt of Rays. I think that was probably the first Celtic Frost song I heard. I used to video trade with a guy in the early 90s, and he gave me a bunch of like Swiss TV live performances of, Into the Crypt of Rays, and I forget, it was like just some like almost like rock bandstand show. And so that was like that was the first time actually seeing them play live, and the whole corpse paint, leather.
Yeah, they did the whole thing. Deal. He had kind of the eyeliner underneath, and
and for being like I think it was, I don't remember when this was from. This was like from 85 or 86. The video is from, but at that point I hadn't seen a whole lot of like anybody that kind of like super like melodramatic look.
I think the only other band I can think of at that time would be Show No Mercy, Hell Awaits era Slayer.
Yeah,
and I mean I would probably argue Slayer and Celtic Frost are probably the two biggest influences on multiple genres. Like I can't see another two bands like that, whereas Bathory almost had direct influence almost single-handedly on black metal, not so much on death metal. Celtic Frost and Slayer were like, dude, everybody listened to those two bands if you were in the extreme metal kind of stuff. Universally. And
Bathory really wasn't even that widely recognized till like Bloodfire Death. Internationally.
So, but we'll talk more about the actual creation of Celtic Frost and Morbid Tales when we come back. But we've got Triumph of Death, which is pretty epic. So kind of prepare yourself. So the song doesn't even really get going until about 3 minutes in, and then you start to get like a song out of the gurgling stuff. And one interesting note about Triumph of Death, when Jeff Grankor Kuhn and I had our temporary band. Which went by many monikers. But when we were sophomores, juniors in high school, the riff that we had for a song called Topeka, which is about the wonderful town of Topeka, Kansas, and all the opportunities it offered to humankind, it turns out when we heard Triumph of Death, we had actually bastardized a Celtic Frost riff without actually even hearing Celtic Frost.
I think Celtic Frost subliminally has. These are all of the most primal riffs, metal riffs imaginable. Like they wrote them all. That nobody else could pull out that simply.
And that's the beauty of Celtic Frost, is the simplicity of sort of the guitar playing and stuff here. So, but we got Triumph of Death from Hellhammer, and then we're gonna go into a pair of tunes from the debut from Celtic Frost, Morbid Tales, which we'll talk about more. Got the intro called Human, which blends. Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like the beginning of what's Opeth, My Arms, Your Hearse. Into the Crypts of Rays, and then one of the quintessential songs in probably the history of extreme metal, which is Procreation of the Wicked. Procreation of the Wicked, Into the Crypts of Rays, and Triumph of Death. And if you know what the Crypts of Rays are, Mark and I were too lazy to look them up, but
I'm sure it means something evil.
Yeah, it's probably something evil. But Morbid Tales. So like I said, Apocalyptic Raids from Hellhammer was put out in '84. And actually, we should mention that before, or right around the same time as Apocalyptic Raids, Noise put out a compilation called Death Metal, which may have predated Possessed use of the song Death Metal.
Who knows how widely
which Seven Churches was out in '84, and that had Halloween, Running Wild, and Dark Avenger, and then, of course, 2 songs from Hellhammer. So that must have been a really
I think I've actually heard, I don't think I ever owned it, but I think I heard it on, it might have been on tape or a dub or something, but seeing how much that Hellhammer stood out from those other bands.
Well, it's probably like that Scandinavian Metal Attack with Bathory. I mean, there was probably that was just like, what the hell?
Well, that was kind of a total fluke that Bathory even got on the thing.
Because the one band dropped off, right?
Yeah.
I think is how it goes. So anyways, and then March of '84 is Apocalyptic Raids, and not too long after that they broke up, and then of course you get Morbid Tales, which was put out in 1984.
The first EP.
Yeah, an EP. And I think a lot of people like myself and you were kind of talking about this, like, I always forget this is an EP. It's like a 24-minute thing, which wasn't really that much shorter than an actual album back in the day. No,
for metal, but
not too much shorter. But the thing is, I guess the European version only had 6 songs originally, and then they throw the American version, which was put out, had 2 extra songs. It had Morbid Tales and Dethroned Emperor on it.
Yeah, so that's the one I've got. The Noise US version of that.
And that brought up to 8 songs. And then if you're like me and you bought a copy, which I think was re-released in like 99.
Noise put it out again with Emperor's Return.
Yeah, and so it for all intents and purposes is like 12 songs and looks like a full length to me. So I never really think of Morbid Tales as an EP. You get Morbid Tales in '84, and then August of '85, Emperor's Return, and these are sort of the 2 primitive statements, and you can really probably talk about them fairly, side by side.
I mean, on a creative level, they're not really too distant. So.
No, and the only difference is when you get to Emperor's Return is the Reed St. Mark takes over for drums. So the guy playing drums here is not Blood Hunter Bruce Day, but it's Stephen Priestley.
Yeah.
Not to be confused with Stephen Pearcy from Rat.
So, not at all.
For those of you who might have gotten confused there. The thing that we were talking about, though, is what kind of access these guys had to within the American market. We were talking about how, whether or not the West Coast, thrash scene was kind of getting access to Celtic Frost, like they were, say, like King Diamond and Merciful Fate because of Lars Ulrich.
Yeah. Well, I think this was kind of when the tape trading scene, was pretty much going full tilt at the time too. Not necessarily the underground extreme metal stuff, but just in general.
Well, I'm sure guys like Chuck with Mantis was getting a hold of this, and the guys from Possessed probably knew of Celtic Frost and were kind of and Hellhammer and all that kind of stuff. It's weird. We haven't mentioned Celtic Frost is from Switzerland, and so whether or not they had access to the American market, is kind of beyond me. Switzerland, not exactly the bastion of metal. I can think of 3 bands that probably matter. These guys, Samael and Corner, are the only 3 I can think of.
Oh, and you've got
Elastis, which was Samael, basically.
Yeah. But the funny thing, like all those bands have that weird kind of like power chord structure.
Oh yeah.
It's more about like groove than it is about like precision or like guitar virtuoso.
Although Coroner had a little bit more.
Coroner was more virtuoso, probably in the thrash realm than the other guys.
So, but I guess Tom Warrior wrote some Coroner tunes, some of the early Coroner stuff,
but was never on a record.
And the Coroner guys were actually the original roadies for Celtic Frost on their first couple tours.
That's
so
hilarious.
There you go, a little tidbits of information out there. But Procreation of the Wicked, which we just heard, just an incredibly, I would say this and Dethroned Emperor are kind of the 2 ultimate templates of the Celtic Frost riff.
Yeah.
Procreation of the Wicked's, I guess, the slower, groovier kind of one, and Dethroned Emperor is the sort of the more, I don't know, the obituary riff.
Those 2 songs and kind of are almost the blueprint of Obituary.
Yeah.
Like completely. Obituary are not anything more than a Celtic Frost band with more extreme vocals.
Yeah.
At least the first couple records.
And John, and you were talking about how some of the gurgling and weird stuff that he was doing on Triumph of Death is like
totally Tardy.
It's John Tardy, trying to, where I'm sure those guys back then were Executioner, like in 84, 85. I'm sure when they got their hands on this, they're like, oh, we got to totally change our entire direction of what we're doing.
I wonder from like a sociological standpoint, I mean, look at that Norway and black metal. I mean, these like picturesque, pristine, relatively conflict-free areas along with Switzerland.
Yeah, absolutely.
And those are the places where these kind of like dark underbellies are from.
Merciful Fate in Denmark. I mean, one of the highest standards of living in the world as well. I mean, it's weird. And then the way it sort of attaches itself in certain American communities. I mean, Florida has some kind of rough and tumble kind of places. I mean, I don't think Tampa's probably the safest place in the world. It's no Miami, but and then
but it's also not Birmingham.
Some of that stuff.
I mean, because England's got definitely that social upheaval kind of thing. Yeah. So I don't. It's
the classism kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I don't
go back and look at where all the stuff erupted from. Where I mean, like there wasn't a ton of social unrest or any of the really like key figures. Really.
Well, and Fenrez was talking about that. That was probably the only thing I found interesting in that whole documentary, that black metal documentary that we watched. Was Fenrez was talking about how he was always drawn to art that came from like static suburban homogenous societies, because he said that was like when he dug under the underbelly of sort of pop art, like the crap that like middle class people just decorate their houses with, when you actually like get into the underbelly of like what people who live in like you said, a conflict-free society, what they actually are able to sort of create out of sort of boredom or angst of like having nothing to really care about or fight against, I mean, the whole UK punk and the hardcore scene in America, was rallying against Reagan. The UK punk scene was coming out of like economic plight in England and job loss and all this, and so it was sort of breeding that, the late 60s rock and roll stuff in America was coming out of, Vietnam and civil rights sort of unrest.
Yeah.
And so that stuff made tangible sense. You understood exactly what they're talking about, but I don't know, when you're a discontented youth and you have nothing to fight against, I guess you start writing songs about like Satan and doorways to hell and evil and because you're just like, what can I do to shock, the white establishment?
I think there's that, just to shake it up a little bit, to actually make something that garners some kind of response, not just, yes.
Yeah.
Not it's Ikeified or something.
And it's weird because, like I've always thought of art as being a product of like the sort of conflict going on in society, and it never really occurred to me these sort of peaceful socialist kind of states where everything's perfect and equal.
And I had a pretty much nuclear upbringing as far as no any kind of like conflicts or horrible scarring experiences, but I've always been drawn to the opposite of that kind of stuff.
Same here, you know? Yeah, the sort of degenerative art or something, just the stuff that comes from conflict. I think if you're just in that really kind of comfortable, nurturing environment all the time, you want to know like, well, what the hell's all this other stuff about? Well, and then you scratch the surface, you look at what's going on in the world, and obviously there's disturbing things, and when you grow up in a place like maybe Switzerland, you're sort of censored from all that, it's like all sanitized, and so
when you seek it out, like we grew up in a small area in the middle of Michigan, and we were always seeking out those other things, like where did this stuff come from, like what's actually happening, not just the the Walmartized kind of like gentrified history that kind of pervades us right now.
So it's something about Northern Europe, mountains, and sort of socialist perfection, utopian perfection or something, like that. I mean, Switzerland has its mountain, Norway, Sweden have their mountains, I don't know if Denmark does per se, but who knows. But that's a really interesting thought, and Frost is certainly on the front lines of that, because I mean, I can't think of anything else that was even remotely sounded like this at this point.
No. I don't think anything ever really kind of captured the purity of these first couple records either.
No, not at all. And their influence obviously widespread. We were just talking about Obituary, but down the road, you're going to hear at the end of the show, when they start to get a little more experimental, you start to hear the influence on bands like Anathema and Bride and stuff. And so it's
I don't think there's any area or subgenre of metal that they didn't touch in some capacity.
Now, the breakdown, I'm just kind of thinking back to, we were talking about how Procreation of the Wicked and Dethroned Emperor are kind of the two twin, riffs, I guess, of these guys. in Scum, the debut grind record from Napalm, the sort of famous breakdown.
I think that's more the Nocturnal Fear breakdown.
Oh, okay.
That's what I'm hearing, at least.
Okay, you're hearing more
and that's
of that.
The Nocturnal Fear kind of breakdown is the same one that Napalm's transmutated 50, 60 times now.
Sure. Well, they even have, they got the opening track on one of their 2000 records. I think it was the one from 2002.
Order the Leech?
Yeah, the opening track. They even have the Celtic Frost breakdown and Barney screams. And Barney screams, "Procreation!"
Oh, that's right.
And he even it's like his ode to Celtic Frost. So Celtic Frost's not a death metal band. They're not a thrash band. They're not just an avant-garde doom.
They're kind of their own.
Not even a grind band or anything. They're just kind of doing their own thing. But this next tune, Dethroned Emperor, this is my favorite Celtic Frost tune for whatever reason. I don't know. It's just like I can listen to it any time and feel good. It just sort of gets me
And it's
motivated.
not, because Procreation and Into the Crypt are kind of the go-to if they're going to have a best of record or something.
Sure.
Those would be the ones. But this is kind of the third one or the stepchild of the group or something. But
the third
ultimately
single,
there's more
which
there.
people forget was floating around. And then we get into Visions of Mortality, which is coming up, which is just, again, a pretty quality, standard kind of Celtic Frost tune from Morbid Tales. And then Danse Macabre, which...
Their first kind of foray into the bizarre, the avant-garde, I don't know what they were listening to at the time, if it was just purely them trying to evoke some kind of, emotion or evoke some kind of incantation.
No, and that's what it sounds like. It sounds like, like teenagers trying to conjure Satan. You know? I've just been reading this book, Fargo Rock City, and Chuck Klosterman, he's talking, the chapter I just read was all about sort of the kind of teenage obsession with Satanism in the 80s and how trendy it was and stuff. And I can imagine like in 84 picking this vinyl up and putting it on and being like, oh my god, something's happening. It sounds like they're playing like the record backwards and speaking backwards, and there's
like something you shouldn't hear almost. It's got that taboo quality,
and it got a horror movie theme kind of aspect to it. I mentioned it reminded me of the Fantomas interpretation of the Omen theme, or kind of like Goblin's soundtrack for Dario Argento films. Or
it's Tom where you're like using his voice as a keyboard instead of using any kind of other orchestration to kind of get that.
And I think this is one of their truly most successful avant-garde attempts. Some of the stuff that they'll do with Into the Pandemonium is kind of like fumbling and kind of like too much too soon kind of stuff. And this feels right. I mean, it doesn't take away from like the atmosphere of the record of being like sort of evil and in your face, know. And then we're going to kind of close things out with one of the punkier tunes, which Mark mentioned, which is Nocturnal Fear. Definitely had, as you said, probably the most influence maybe on the grind.
Yeah, I think as far as the catchiness, the breakdowns to grind.
Sure. So
and speed really too.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we'll get into speed when we sort of start to close things out. But so we got a set of 4: Dethroned Emperor, Visions of Mortality, Danse Macabre, and Nocturnal Fear. And Dethroned Emperor you can find on the American version of Morbid Tales or on the Emperor's Return, which came out in August of '85. So,
which I think you pretty much get them on the same record.
Yeah,
I have them separate.
Oh, do you?
I do. Well, I have Emperor's Return is on its own, but then I have the Morbid Tales with the extra stuff on as well.
Okay, cool.
It's come out a billion different ways.
Yeah, so these are the first two things from Celtic Frost here. So enjoy Dethroned Emperor. that was Nocturnal Fear, Danse Macabre, Visions of Mortality, and we opened with Dethroned Emperor. Like I said, we kind of got some changes going on in the band at this point after Morbid Tales. In August of '85, they put out Emperor's Return, which has a new drummer. Priestley's gone, Reed St. Mark's in. And then something happens between Emperor's Return and the recording of their first full-length, To Therion a couple months later, because To Therion comes out in October, only mere 3-4 months after the Emperor's Return EP, and founding member and Hellhammer compatriot Martin Ain is gone, and Dominic Steiner has sort of moved into playing bass on their debut full length, I guess, To Therion.
Yeah.
So
lovely H.R. Geiger cover with a devil with a slingshot or something.
Yeah, pretty. It's Satan is the title of the cover, and H.R. Geiger, of course, has done. We talked about him in the Danzig show, and then he's designed the aliens and the carcass sculpture for artwork and stuff. So obviously, kind of a extreme metal staple, in the art world. So, but the tune we have for you is from Emperor's Return, and that's the only place you could find it, say, unlike Dethroned Emperor, which you could find kind of in both and stuff. It's a tune called Visual Aggression, and it's probably the fastest Celtic Frost song up until this point. Maybe
it's almost got the Death Crush riff in it, too.
Yeah, for sure. And I was going to say that about the tune we just heard, Nocturnal Fear, is that song, as punky as it is, and you said it influenced probably Napalm Death, I would say it is equally that sort of punk attitude influence, I guess, even in shape sort of the way that bands like Dark Throne and Mayhem kind of approach some of the riffing that they did. And you definitely hear it in a song like this, Visual Aggression, which has there's a Repulsion vibe to it as well, whether it's the velocity,
gargly bass kind of
that's sort of
tone,
like just the crappy amp sort of sound or whatever, that sort of fuzz that's kind of coming off. And so obviously this probably would have a big influence on the Swedish sound as well. So
seeing as most of the old Swedish death metal stuff was played out of bass amps anyways.
Yeah. And it's weird, if you were to sort of draw Celtic Frost in the middle as sort of like a flow chart, you could probably trace a lot of and connect almost every sort of metal genre back. Even gothic metal, as crappy as some of that stuff is, like the Napalm Records stuff, and some of the things that they're going to pull off in part 2, you can trace that kind of experimental, weird gothic metal stuff back to the Frost and stuff. So, but so we got Visual Aggression, and then we're going to sort of open the casket to Therion. We'll talk a lot more about Therion when we open up part 2, but like I said, the record comes out in October '85. Therion, just for those of you who are scholarly out there, means the Great Beast. And so we're going to go from Visual Aggression into Dawn of Meggido. And Meggido is, of course, a famous...
was Hebrew city?
Hebrew city, which biblically, I guess, is the site of Armageddon and a big battle, Judgment Day and some
That's cool
kind of stuff. So,
also a Satyricon EP.
So the Dawn of Armageddon is really kind of what it means. And what's cool about this is, again, you're starting to hear some of the experimentation you heard on, say, Danse Macabre. You'll hear a timpani drum being played by Reed St. Mark.
Which I think is even translated into black metal as the thunder drum.
Yeah, there you go. Thor and Zeus doing their thing up on Mount Olympus there. Or not Mount Olympus, geez, I'm getting freaking Norse and Greek religion mixed up.
That's awesome.
Odin is what I meant.
We've got French horns on there as well.
Yeah, and some French horns. So and
the most eerie of the horns.
Yeah, this is pretty ballsy. The most metal I think for a extreme metal band, '85 to start to step out and put French horns and timpanis and things. I
remember hearing something about the session of the musicians coming in to record that, as well as it being kind of bizarre. I can't think of any anecdotes or anything from it.
Well, and a song we're not going to play, but more of an instrumental tune on here, they actually bring Steve Warrior back from the Hellhammer days, and he does some sound effects and different things. So it's an interesting record. We'll talk a lot more about it. We've got our kind of closing when we come back, and we'll say our goodbyes for part 1, but definitely to Therion, you'll hear an introduction to it with Dawn of Meggido. So enjoy Visual Aggression and Dawn of Meggido. That was Dawn of Meggido and Visual Aggression. We've got one more tune left from To Mega Therion, but it's, fear not, Circle of Tyrant fans. You'll have to stick around for part 2 to hear a continuation of To Mega Therion, as well as our exploration into the wackier side of Celtic Frost. But the tune we're going to close out with has a very immortal black metal title.
Beyond the North Winds.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't get any more black metal.
Kind of where Black Shirt came from, isn't it?
Yeah, there you go. And it's a short but sweet one. Not too experimental, not like what you just heard with Dawn of Meggido and stuff, but just a great opening riff. I mean, just super catchy.
I think this is kind of where we start hearing the depth of sound a little bit more. I think that they're messing with their the heads and the amps they're using, and it's more about, I think Celtic Frost is all about holding the notes out more than having a flurry of them,
Sure. And as much, we talked about all the influence these guys had, and Mark and I, when we were listening to this during the break, we mentioned the Dutch scene as well. I mean, as Fix, the king of kind of open note.
As Fix, Thanatos, Pestilence, all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, even Pestilence is sort of guitar tone. You hear it in Beyond the North Winds. You won't hear the technicality that you'll hear with Pestilence, but definitely pretty cool stuff. So, but yeah, let us know what you thought of part 1. Shoot us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com, or
leave us a comment on requiempodcast.com. Leave us a star review rating on iTunes or on TalkShoe.
Yeah, and look us up on Facebook as well. Befriend us.
We'd love to be friends with you.
Heck yeah. And we do listen to suggestions. We've had a couple comments saying they wanted a Celtic Frost show, and so hey, we're here to serve you.
That's right.
So, but
that's all about fitting the stuff in and not doing too much black metal, which
we were on a black metal streak. So also let us know what your feelings are on the 2009 Best of show. If you
we've already gotten some comments on the site.
I'd like to create some controversy.
Yeah, but that's a 2-parter. That's their Christmas gift to you. Is that 3 hours plus?
We slaved hard for that 1 week 2-part show. So, but anyway, so enjoy Beyond the North Winds. Stick around next week for part 2, obviously, of Celtic Frost. But for Requiem Metal Podcast, I'm Jason.
And I'm Mark.